Hi, everybody. Walt Muscle here. And you normally come to my YouTube channel for Japanese history videos. Today, we're going to do something a little different. Today, I'm working with Deanna Lang, who's an author services provider. She lives just north of Sydney, Australia. And she provides, basically, when you write the book, she helps you develop it into a publishing ready format. Now, what we're going to talk about today is a lot of stuff about Shogun. Shogun has just the 10th episode, the final episode just dropped. And so Deanna, who's a Shogun enthusiast, but as I've just found out, is only through episode 5 of the 10 episodes. So I'm trying not to avoid it.
4.5.
Okay. Well, anyway, but we'll talk about that, plus my books as well. I'm a Japanese history enthusiast. So Deanna has a lot of questions related to the real history behind Shogun, which I'm going to try to answer, as well as talk about my books, which are also set in medieval Japan, but roughly 10 years prior to Shogun. So Deanna, we're going to do the first half here on my YouTube channel, and then the second half of this on her YouTube channel, where she does a lot of interviews about books and talking about books, all genres. And so I'll throw it over to Deanna. Deanna, you can go ahead and start with the questions.
Hi. I'm very excited about this because I've been I'm very taken by the whole Shogun world, and Clavell is sort of one of those authors that I've known about for a long time. My husband Steve is a huge Clavell fan, and he's read all the books. And at one point, we even several years ago dug up a very old version of the Noble House TV series that starred Pierce Brosnan. And really enjoyed it, but man, I would love to see a remake of that too, with the modern technology and modern actors and what they can do now as well. Because that version...
Clavell was a screenwriter, and his first novel, he spent, I think, 4 years in a Japanese POW camp, in a camp where only 1 in 15 actually survived. And so he picked up a unique perspective on Japan and an interest that it's hard for anyone to fully comprehend how well he knew his subject.
Yeah.
So his first novel was King Rat, which was set in a Japanese POW camp, considered somewhat autobiographical. And he wrote that. Hollywood was on strike. He was a screenwriter, and Hollywood was on strike at the time. So he sat down and wrote King Rat. I want to say like 800 pages in 12 weeks. And he published that novel.
That is a lot of writing. Yeah.
He was quick. He was very quick. In the case of Shogun, and I only learned this yesterday, one of the executive producers on the new series is Michaela Clavell, his daughter. And so she commented in a podcast that her dad spent 2 years studying the topic of Shogun and reading every book he could find before basically writing the first words about the story. And he had an amazing grasp of details. Now, there are a lot of errors in the book Shogun. The fact that Shogun was so popular. Shogun's over 1,000 pages long. The book was so popular that a group of Japanese history professors put together a freely published work called Learning from Shogun, detailing the mistakes that Clavell made. And that book is around 200 pages long. So it was just that popular, that influential a book. Like I said, I think he published it in 1975, and they made the series in 1980. So it was amazing just what he did. And Clavell, for not having any internet and not having a lot of resources that we have today, he inspired a lot of people in the West to learn more about Japanese culture.
Well, in preparation for this, I actually read through a book about correcting the inaccuracies in Shogun, and
that may be Learning from Shogun.
No, it's not Learning from Shogun. It was another one. Let me see if I can find it. Do I know where it is? I know. I'll have a.
Well, learning from Shogun, just enter that title. Anyone who's
yeah,
watching,
the one.
and you can download that book free.
Yeah,
It's fascinating.
The one that I read was on Kindle Unlimited, and
Okay.
it was by a Japanese.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. The title escapes me at the moment.
Correcting James Clavell's
Shogun.
novel Shogun from the viewpoint of Japanese history and culture by Shiratsuyu Asano.
Shiratsuyu Asano. Yeah,
Yes.
that is a lot of what they did this time around. There were a number of things that were incorrect from Japanese culture in Clavell's work. And so one of the things they did was to try to take in more of the Japanese perspective. The main example they talk about is that in the book, Blackthorn, the main character, the Englishman who shipwrecked in Japan,
Yeah.
does some military teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And he's teaching usage of guns and everything, but that isn't something Japan would have needed instruction on at the time, because they'd already had guns for 50 years. They were using it over 50 years. They were using it quite well.
Sorry,
but what he did bring in was cannon technology, sea cannon, ship technology.
Right.
And so they changed the story in the series to reflect that he could teach them naval tactics, which would have been new to the Japanese.
Right. Can I ask you a question then?
Go ahead.
Point, which is, if Clavell had studied Japanese culture and he had been a POW for a period of time,
mm-hmm.
why then would he have had inaccuracies in his book, considering that, he was fairly immersed? And maybe it's different when you're a POW. I do not know.
No, it's a very simple answer. There was no Clavell before Clavell.
Right. And there was no internet either, so
no internet back in the 70s. And so basically what Clavell is doing, Clavell is working with the best available information he has. And so because of his connections, he has access to resources. And he does make a lot of mistakes, and that gets corrected in the current series, but trying to stay true to the main story.
Right.
But you have to think of Clavell as being the first person to do something. He is the first person from the West to do all of this.
Right.
And you had Japanese authors, but how big of an interest is there outside of academia in the works of those Japanese authors? And there wasn't until Clavell came along and gave this story. And because he was a screenwriter, he had the ability a well-known screenwriter, he had the ability to create an engaging story.
Yep.
And then he also,
and I think the interesting thing here is the fact that, when I look at it from a modern perspective and what's going on in the publishing world now, and I'm not going to open a can of worms, but, back in the day, like you said, there was no Clavell, and Clavell was leading the
Western interest in Japan was Clavell's work.
The interest in other cultures outside of the West. And I think the reception back then was very different, because it was like, wow, this is really interesting. This is really different. I'm learning something new. Versus now, there's a lot of blowback against, well, you can't do that because you're not XYZ from XYZ culture, and therefore it's cultural appropriation. And if you're not,
and that's a topic. I spent 4 years in Japan. My wife is Japanese, so my kids were dual for many years. They're now adults. So that you have this, but you have to look at what they did in the new series. One of the most brilliant ideas they had was Hiroyuki Sanada, who plays Toranaga, the character in Shogun based on Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man who created the shogunate, the family class that ruled for over 250 years. They made Hiroyuki Sanada an executive producer. And so where he was an actor before, and he said this, I heard him talk about it on the podcast. There were things he wanted to change, but because he was not the actor, because he was an actor, not the producer, he felt a little bit, should he be doing this? I mean, he's the most respected person on the set. And there's still, because he's got that, I'm the actor. I mean, the man's brilliant. I mean, an amazing actor. And he has the knowledge that everyone needs.
Yeah.
But they made him an executive producer. And at that point, he has the ability to put into place a lot of the things that he knows from his own work in Japan. Says, we need to do things this way. We need to do things this way.
Yeah.
They spent a lot of time, like I said, correcting things. There were certain things in Shogun that they did not correct for history just because it was impossible to do. One of the funny things I heard about was, you're used to seeing Japanese people in historical dramas sitting on the backs of their heels. If you don't talk about this, it's called the seiza position, where you're sitting. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where basically,
yes, I do. Yeah, yeah. I grew
They're
up.
basically they're sitting down. They're sitting down their heels. For Westerners, it's very hard to do because it hurts your knees at some point.
Yeah. So
especially someone my age.
Yeah, for context and so that this sort of helps is, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s.
Yes.
And growing up in Malaysia, there was not much Western television.
Mm-hmm.
And there was not much television to begin with. So, my early television influences was what they call today J-drama and K-drama. So I watched a lot of Japanese television and Japanese drama, live action, as well as anime and cartoons and things like that growing up. So a lot of what you're talking about, and certainly, from a sort of absorption or knowledge via osmosis kind of thing, not that I've studied the topic, but because I've read some books and I've watched a lot of Japanese television, I know a lot about Japanese history and culture. It might not necessarily be correct because it was television in the 70s and 80s, but I know enough that the whole Shogun world and all the concepts and all the cultural references and the food and the bowing and the sitting and all of that stuff. I know all of that. But so yes, I do know what you mean about sitting sitting back on their heels. It's not comfortable.
It's not comfortable. The thing is, though, they had to do this. Wasn't the way their historian had proof that this wasn't the way you sat in this time period.
Right.
There was a different way you sat back then. I think you had one knee up or something. But everyone in Japan, in watching historical dramas, is used to seeing people sit back on their heels.
Yes.
And so they had to basically leave them sitting back on the heels to not throw off the Japanese audience, who would look at why are they doing it that way? There were other things. Everybody in the show is wearing shoes. I mean, straw sandals or something light, which more often back then they would have actually been barefoot. And that's another place where they made a change that's a little different.
And
but one of the things,
shoe change?
I think they were filming in Vancouver in all types of weather. I'm not sure why they did that.
They
I
didn't
just
want
read that
toes
somewhere.
falling off.
Yeah, frostbite was an issue. I don't know. But yeah, they had shoes. One of the things that he did change, the main female, the female lead, Mariko, they have a. It's very common to have for a girl for women to have a ko on the end of their name, but this was not the case. In that time period, they didn't use them. It's uh, I forget the term where it's I cannot remember the term. It starts with an A, but what basically they left Mariko's name because that's the main character. But then the secondary female character Fujiko, they changed her name to Fuji. They
Right,
dropped the ko. They
right.
changed other names of characters that they could get away with in the series.
So
For
Mariko's name would have
example,
been,
the what's that?
so Mariko's name would have been Mari?
Um, it would have been something. I don't know what she would have been. Her name was the character on which Mariko was based. Her real name was Akechi Tama. Akechi is the family name, and Tama was her first name. She married to a samurai named Hosokawa, and then she had a Christian name because she converted. She became a Christian in 1587, and so her baptismal name was Gracia. So it was Hosokawa Gracia, is how she's known to history. Japan's most famous female Christian, but her real name was Tama. So it would have been something like that. Fuji's another one. It could be Mari, but no, there was no ko on the end. That's I can still not remember that term. Starts with
And
but
the ko at the end, is it an sort of
it's a modern ending to female names.
right, okay,
So it's out of place
right.
in the 16th century. Another thing, if you go back to the original series back in 1980, there's a huge thing that comes out of the book about calling him son. And so he wasn't supposed to use the word, call him Omi. Omi, one of the characters, you call him Omi-san. Call him Omi-san. San doesn't exist in that time period either. Clavell didn't know that.
Right.
So,
And so that's why, is it why the ends of the names are like Mariko Sama, Toda Sama? Is the Sama in place of the San?
no, San doesn't exist. San's more of Sama was only used for people with high standing.
Right.
You had to have an elevated position. It's
Right.
just an honorable way of saying Mr. or Ms.
Right.
But honor, so that's all you would do though with
Okay.
the Sama. It was just an elevated esteemed. I guess that we could translate it as esteemed so and so.
Right. So would it be like a sir or a lord or a
Yeah. Well, Lord, you hear the term Lord. Lord is Don. You hear the term often in Shogun, Dono, Dono,
right?
and that's Lord. That's when they say Dono. That's the address. That's the address for the way of addressing the Lord.
Okay. All right. So let's sort of move on from all the things that they fixed, because I'm sure there is a lot and we could probably spend hours talking about it. But
Yes.
tell me, what do you love about it? What in the show have you just really loved?
Well, I mentioned earlier, but I fell in life. I fell in love with the character of Fuji back in 1980. When the book came out, I was in elementary school. I was not able to read it or comprehend it yet. So my first acquaintance with Shogun was the series in 1980, and I basically fell for the Fujiko character played by Hiromi Senno, and she was brilliant. Still alive, but she is retired, and she was amazing. And so I read the book, The character's even more amazing. And then the actress they got to play her, Moeka Hoshi, has basically been a masterclass. I think my dog. I've got to stop him to go out. Hold on. Sorry about that. My wife came in to get him, and since the door was closed, I had the door closed. But it's been basically a masterclass is something a word somebody else used, but it has just been if you've ever had somebody convey emotion on screen,
Mhm.
it is an amazing performance, and she deserves any and every award that can possibly be Emmys, best supporting actress, whatever. I don't know what else is out. I don't know how they do that, but it's been amazing. And I think she has captured the hearts. The one thing I have seen is basically they do not end the book. They do not end in the case of Fuji, they do not end the show like they end the book, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, because obviously we chatted before we
Yes.
sat down and filmed this so that we could be somewhat prepared. And you did mention Lady Fuji and how
Yes.
everybody has fallen in love with her. At that point,
She is my literary crush of all time.
right.
Like I said, in my first book, The Samurai's Heart, I based my heroine on the original actress Hiromi Senno.
Right. So after you told me about her, I had only watched up to episode 3, and I'm at now 4.5. So, I'm a slow TV watcher. And part of that also with regards to Shogun is because it's all subtitled. Most of it is in Japanese. And aside from having to read the subtitles, and this is the brilliance of the director and the actors and the producers, okay, is there is so much to be said or that they say just in their facial expressions and their body language that I find I have to pay not only attention to just reading the subtitles, but just really watching how they're saying one thing and words are coming out of their mouth, but their body language and their expressions say something completely different. So I find it very intense to watch and quite tiring, which is part of the reason why I'm not blowing through it. It's not a easy watch in that sense. But after you mentioned Lady Fuji, when I was watching episode 4 and part of episode 5, I really paid attention when she came on the screen. And I think my impression of her is that I love that she has this sweetness that really shines through, but at the same time, you can tell this core strength in the woman who has survived so much tragedy and so much grief.
Yes.
And she does it with so much grace and dignity.
One of the things that's funny, and after episode 4, a meme went around with Fuji holding the guns. And Shogun FX released it, holding the guns up to against Omi and go, and it just says underneath, "Please be on your way." She's got a smile and everything. It's just, and then there's another episode. There's another thing that's coming up in episode 9 that you haven't seen yet, where it's, if I can say it, if people have seen it, I can say it.
You can spoiler
Mariko
me.
just.
You can spoiler me, but maybe whoever's watching this and hasn't got to episode 9 yet might want to click off for a little while here.
So basically, she turns around and they're denying her. They're denying her the ability to leave the castle. So she turns around, looks at her, the 2 attendants, 2 samurai behind her, and says, "Okiri kudasare," which they translate on screen as "please kill him." And I heard it and I said, that kind of means, please kill them for me. and it's said very sweetly, but very, it's just, and it comes across as steely eyed, and you think to myself, and I know what's about to happen. I start laughing at the same time, because of one of the things, but it's just because it comes across, and that's the way that's the way both of them come across. If you're old enough to remember, if you're old enough to remember Gilligan's Island,
Oh gosh. I
I know.
too. I didn't grow up watching Gilligan's Island, but I'm old enough
Yes.
to remember it. Again, it's this whole no access to Western television thing.
Well, anyone who's old enough to remember Gilligan's Island who would understand that I put this up on my page. Um, Monaco and Fuji are the Ginger and Maryanne of Shogun.
Right.
And so basically Ginger being the glamorous actress, Maryanne being the girl next door. And so that is the exact model that you're seeing in front of you when you look at Monaco and Fujiko, or Monaco and Fuji.
Right.
Fujiko in the book. And that's what you sort of get from them. It's really, and it's they have, both actresses did an amazing job with these roles. So many people did an amazing thing with this series. I enjoyed it. I've watched every episode at least twice, with the exception of episode 10. I'm still watching it a second time.
Okay.
I've seen some episodes 3 times.
I'm going to ask you one last question, and then we're gonna end it here, and then we'll hop over to my channel and finish it up with some more questions. So
Sure, go ahead.
yeah, you obviously speak Japanese, having lived there, being married to a Japanese lady, and I assume are quite immersed in the culture. How much of the Japanese did you pick up in the show versus having to rely on the subtitles?
How much, let's say one thing. Even when I lived in Japan, I sounded like, this was back in the 90s. I sounded like a middle school kid who had swallowed a dictionary, because that was about my level of Japanese. But I had because of my jobs, I had very specific vocabularies that I could talk about. For example, I could imagine a 6th grader discussing product liability in Japanese. That was something I could do. Just because that was part of my job, and I had to learn the lingo in dealing with. I worked for a machine tool company, and I had to explain product liability to the trading company and what they were dealing with in the U.S. versus what they would deal with in Japan.
Right.
And so that became a way I communicated, and I did a lot of that. And so I also would call myself, I would say, I speak Japanese as well as any drunk businessman ordering a taxi after midnight. So my Japanese has deteriorated remarkably, dramatically since then.
Do you speak Japanese at home?
We have used English. When we were dating, we got into a few fights because I misunderstood what she was saying. And so in the interest of staying, while we do speak Japanese a few times, and there's sometimes when my wife at a party where she wants to say something just to me, she'll say something in Japanese really quick because she knows I'm the only one who's going to catch it. And if I'm not, and so it's like, do this, like, when you give those signals to your spouse, that's what she'll do to me. But what it's been, because staying married required me to space more often than not to use English, because it was I made too many mistakes when we were dating to take a chance on losing her.
That's
but the best episode for me was as far as my Japanese language abilities, the best episode for me is episode 6. I could follow about 50% of that.
okay.
Now, the embarrassing thing about that is that's the episode about the red light district and the prostitutes in Japan. So why I couldn't say 50% of that one.
What is that? Oh my gosh, what must I say about you? Okay, I think we're gonna stop here.
Okay.
and you can wrap it up for us, and then we'll do the next session.
Definitely. Thank you, everybody. Like I said, this is part one. Please check out Deanna's channel for part two, and continue on with the interview and everything else that's going on. Thank you for watching. And again, please check out part two. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.